Imagine arriving at work each day, carrying the weight of a growing secret and the gaze of judgmental eyes. For Elina, a young receptionist at the prestigious tech firm Novatech, this is her reality. With each passing day, she fights to balance the demands of a high-pressure job, a complicated past, and an unexpected future. But when a single mistake brings her face-to-face with the company's cold and powerful CEO, Rhys Maddox, her world begins to unravel. Little does she know, the tension between them holds a secret neither of them is ready to face. One that will challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves, about each other, and about the lives they've built. What begins as an unassuming workday soon spirals into a life-altering journey of humility, forgiveness, and love. Before we jump into this story, drop a comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from. If this story resonates with you, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss out on more inspiring and unforgettable tales coming your way. Elina was always the first to arrive at Novatech, a towering tech company dominating the city's skyline and one of the most formidable workplaces around. As a receptionist, her days were often filled with answering calls, managing schedules, and guiding guests through the intimidating, sleek hallways of Novatech. To the bustling executives and determined employees who streamed through the lobby each day, she was just another background figure. But for Elina, every day at Novatech was a battle for stability. At 26, Elina was facing more responsibility than ever. She was 5 months pregnant, and with no partner by her side, she felt alone in the journey that lay ahead. Her parents had disapproved of her career choices from the start, preferring her to settle down with a stable partner rather than taking a demanding job in a competitive city. But despite the challenges, Elina had always been resilient, determined to build her life on her own terms. Each morning, she chose her outfit carefully to avoid drawing attention to her growing belly. Loose, professional clothing became her daily armor, designed to mask the signs of pregnancy from her colleagues. She often caught sidelong glances and whispers from other employees, but their words were drowned out by her need to keep working, no matter what. Financial stability was no longer just about her own future. Now, it was about securing a life for the child growing inside her. Elina's life at Novatech was marked by an unspoken isolation. Her colleagues were cordial but distant, sharing polite smiles and small talk that never went beyond surface-level exchanges. Her pregnancy only seemed to widen the invisible gap, with colleagues offering her subtle, judgmental looks instead of genuine kindness. While no one openly commented on her condition, she could feel the air thicken with whispers behind her back, remarks barely concealed in awkward silences and uncomfortable pauses. One particular morning, Elina arrived a few minutes late. She had spent most of the early hours dealing with a wave of nausea that wouldn't subside, and the delay threw off her morning routine. As she finally entered the lobby, her heart sank. The imposing figure of Rhys Maddox, Novatech's CEO, was striding across the room, his usual entourage of high-ranking employees in tow. Rhys was known throughout the industry as an intense and strategic leader, a man with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. His reputation as a relentless businessman who tolerated no mistakes was nearly as famous as the company itself. Rhys Maddox was tall, with a commanding presence that could silence a room without him needing to speak a word. His piercing gaze swept over anyone who dared stand in his way, making it clear he had no time for those who couldn't keep up. To someone like Rhys, Elina was practically invisible. She had often heard stories of his cold manner, how he dismissed employees who fell short of his exacting standards, sometimes with nothing more than an indifferent glance. Elina felt her pulse quicken as she hurried toward her desk, hoping to avoid any encounter with the CEO. But as fate would have it, her haste only led to trouble. In her rush, she accidentally bumped into him, spilling his coffee all over his pristine, tailored suit. Time seemed to freeze as the dark stain spread across his jacket and down his sleeve. Elina's heart stopped, and for a moment she could only stare, horrified by what she'd just done. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Maddox," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She could feel her face flush with embarrassment, her hands shaking as she clutched her notepad tighter. Rhys's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched as he took in the sight of his ruined suit. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, but each word was laced with unmistakable fury. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Elina's heart sank further. She tried to stammer an apology, but he cut her off, his gaze as cold as steel. "This is why we avoid hiring people who can't manage simple tasks. You're clumsy, distracted, and clearly not focused on your job." His gaze dropped pointedly to her midsection, and a slight, disdainful smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe, if you weren't so occupied with personal issues, you'd be able to handle something as basic as walking down a hallway." Humiliation washed over Elina as she felt the eyes of the entire lobby on her. Rhys hadn't just criticized her professionalism. He had called her out on her pregnancy in front of her colleagues, turning a small accident into a public spectacle. She fought to keep her composure, but her cheeks burned with shame, and her throat tightened as she held back tears. With one final, cold glance, Rhys turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone, feeling exposed and humiliated. The crowd around her dispersed, but Elina could feel the weight of their stares, the lingering judgment in their glances as they returned to their tasks. She managed to make her way back to her desk, her hands trembling as she settled into her chair. Her mind was still reeling, replaying Rhys's harsh words over and over. Later that night, as Elina sat in her small apartment, the weight of the day bore down on her. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling a gentle flutter from the baby inside her. This life she was carrying was the one thing keeping her grounded, giving her strength even on days as difficult as these. But the future felt daunting, an endless stretch of challenges and uncertainties. How would she navigate it all on her own? Her thoughts drifted to the baby's father, a man she had met only once. It was a fleeting connection that had unexpectedly changed her life, and now, as she considered what lay ahead, the memory of that night lingered in her mind like a bittersweet dream. She didn't know his full name, only his initials, and the brief memory of his kindness. She had once hoped to forget that night and move forward, but the presence of the baby made that impossible. Despite her resolve, Elina often wondered if she had the strength to face the future alone. The thought of losing her job weighed heavily on her. But with each day at Novatech growing more challenging, she couldn't help but question how much longer she could endure the isolation, the judgment, and now the open hostility from Rhys Maddox himself. She wanted to believe that she could handle everything, that she could forge a future for herself and her child without relying on anyone else. But the uncertainty gnawed at her, a constant reminder of how precarious her situation truly was. As the days passed, Elina's anxiety grew, and she felt as if she were balancing on the edge of a cliff. She was fighting for her livelihood, for her dignity, and most importantly, for the future of her unborn child. And though she vowed to keep going, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something that would turn her world upside down. Bookmark. That night, as Elina lay on the worn couch in her tiny apartment, she couldn't shake the weight of her encounter with Rhys Maddox. His words echoed in her mind, each one sharper than the last. Though she had experienced judgment from others before, she had never been humiliated so openly, and by her own CEO no less. She felt utterly defeated, and the shame of it settled over her like a dark cloud, suffocating her as she tried to make sense of it all. A soft movement brought her back to the present, a reminder of the tiny life inside her. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling a gentle flutter, and closed her eyes, willing herself to find some peace in the darkness. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her baby's future too. Every decision she made now carried a weight she hadn't been prepared for. Her mind drifted back to that fleeting night months ago. A night that had seemed like a dream. It was supposed to be a one-time encounter, an escape from her hectic and sometimes lonely life. She had met the man at a charity gala, one of the high-profile events she had been helping to organize as a side job to make ends meet. She could still remember the way he'd looked at her, his gaze warm and kind, a rarity in a city that often felt cold and indifferent. At first, she hadn't wanted to remember that night. It had been easier to bury it, to pretend that it was just a passing moment with a stranger. But her pregnancy had brought that memory to the forefront of her mind, making it impossible to ignore. The only connection she had to him was a pair of initials. She hadn't even asked for his full name, assuming it was unnecessary. Now, she was left with only a fading memory of his face, his kindness, and the impossible realization that he was the father of her child. Elina had told herself she could do this alone, that she didn't need anyone else to help her. She was determined to protect her independence, to raise this child with or without support from others. Her closest friend, Jessa, knew about her pregnancy, but only believed that it had resulted from a brief relationship that had ended quickly. Elina hadn't corrected her. How could she explain the truth? That she didn't even know the man's full name, let alone how to contact him. She didn't want anyone's pity or judgment. She only wanted to move forward, to find a way to secure a future for herself and her child. But no matter how often she reassured herself, doubts crept in, haunting her during the quiet moments. Raising a child alone was a daunting prospect, and as much as she tried to ignore the whispers and judgmental looks from her coworkers, they weighed on her more heavily than she wanted to admit. Her job at Novatech was already a struggle, and the stress of hiding her pregnancy, the fear of losing her job, and the isolation she felt only added to her burden. Each morning, Elina resolved to hold her head high, to keep fighting for the life she wanted for her child. But some days, the weight of it all felt unbearable. She couldn't escape the reality of her situation or the cold indifference of those around her. And as her pregnancy progressed, the challenges at work seemed to grow more intense. The judgment, the microaggressions from coworkers, and the constant pressure to perform left her feeling as though she were balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong step, and everything could come crashing down. The next day, Elina arrived at work with her usual resolve, but the tension in the air was palpable. She tried to focus on her tasks, organizing schedules and fielding calls, but her thoughts kept drifting. She felt the eyes of her colleagues on her, and though no one spoke directly to her, she could sense the undercurrent of speculation and disdain. Her interaction with Rhys the day before had not gone unnoticed, and the unspoken hierarchy within the company had been made painfully clear. Her heart raced as she considered the possibilities. What if Rhys decided that she was no longer worth keeping on? What if her performance, affected by the stress and exhaustion of pregnancy, finally gave him a reason to let her go? She couldn't afford to lose this job, not when every paycheck counted toward her future. The anxiety gnawed at her, and she could feel her hands tremble slightly as she typed, her mind a constant whirl of worry. Throughout the day, Elina found herself glancing at the sleek, modern walls of Novatech, wondering if they would soon become nothing more than a memory. The thought of losing her position here frightened her more than she cared to admit. She had worked hard to establish herself, to prove that she could handle the demands of the job, even if it meant sacrificing her own comfort and health. But now, with her pregnancy becoming more noticeable, she feared that all of her efforts could be undone in an instant. Elina's mind drifted again to the baby's father. She had no illusions about him returning to her life or offering support, yet she couldn't help but wonder what he might say if he knew about the child. Would he even care? Was he the kind of man who would step up, or had he simply moved on without a second thought? The questions were endless, yet she had no answers, only the memory of a night that felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. That evening, as she made her way home, the weight of the day hung heavy on her shoulders. She felt like she was living two lives, one in the demanding high-stakes environment of Novatech, where she was expected to be as efficient and unbreakable as the company's pristine facade, and another in her small, dimly lit apartment, where she could finally let her guard down, if only for a few hours. At home, Elina tried to distract herself, flipping through a parenting book she had borrowed from the library. She was determined to prepare as best as she could, despite the uncertainty. She read about prenatal care, the best ways to bond with her child, and how to cope with the challenges that lay ahead. But even as she turned each page, her mind drifted back to her future at Novatech, and the anxiety that seemed to have taken permanent residence in her heart. Jessa called that night, checking in on her as she often did. Elina almost told her everything, including the struggles, the fear, and the loneliness that came with carrying such a heavy secret. But she held back, unwilling to burden her friend with a story that she herself was still trying to understand. Instead, she brushed off Jess's concerns with reassurances, telling her that everything was fine, that she was managing just fine on her own. But the truth weighed on her, a burden she couldn't share with anyone. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she felt the quiet resolve within her flicker, as if her strength were slowly draining away. She had always believed she could handle whatever life threw her way, that she could overcome any obstacle with enough determination and hard work. But now, with the added responsibility of her unborn child, she wasn't so sure. The future loomed ahead, shrouded in uncertainty. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, that the careful balance she had managed to maintain would soon be disrupted. And while she had always been able to rely on her resilience, she wondered how much longer she could hold on without someone by her side. With a heavy sigh, Elina closed her eyes, her hand resting on her belly as she drifted into an uneasy sleep. The days were growing longer, the challenges more daunting, and though she couldn't see what lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain. She had to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for the life she was bringing into the world. A few days passed, but Elina still couldn't shake the memory of her encounter with Rhys Maddox. She had tried to brush it off, to convince herself that it was just another day at Novatech. But the humiliation lingered, leaving her even more anxious than before. Every morning, she steeled herself to walk through the company's grand lobby, hoping to remain as invisible as possible. On a particularly chaotic Monday, Novatech was abuzz with an intensity Elina had never felt before. Executives hurried down hallways, meeting rooms were fully booked, and the office phones rang non-stop. Elina's inbox was overflowing, and her phone was constantly ringing as she handled countless requests from different departments. Everyone seemed on edge, rushing to meet an upcoming project deadline. Elina tried to keep her head down and focus, moving swiftly from task to task, her hands shaky with both exhaustion and stress. She was making her way across the office, a stack of files in her arms, carefully maneuvering around the maze of desks and workspaces. Her mind was racing, balancing everything she had to do, when she misjudged her footing. Her toe caught on the leg of a chair, and she stumbled, barely managing to keep her balance. But just as she steadied herself, she collided with someone. Elina's heart stopped as she looked up, dread pooling in her stomach. Standing before her, coffee dripping down his jacket, was Rhys Maddox himself. She froze, a feeling of dread washing over her. Rhys's face was a mix of shock and fury, his gaze locked onto her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Time seemed to slow as she realized the severity of her mistake. "Oh no, Mr. Maddox, I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She reached out instinctively, offering him tissues she'd pulled from her pocket, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. But Rhys wasn't in the mood for apologies. He brushed her hand away, his expression hardening as he looked down at the mess on his clothes. "Do you even realize what you've done?" he demanded, his voice low and sharp, like the calm before a storm. "This suit is worth more than a month of your salary." Elina felt the stares of her coworkers around her, silent witnesses to the unfolding scene. No one moved, and no one spoke. She wanted to disappear, to shrink away and avoid the humiliation that was surely coming, but there was nowhere to hide, and she could feel her cheeks flushing with each passing second. Rhys took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her, his gaze dropping to the gentle curve of her belly, barely concealed beneath her oversized blouse. "It's no wonder you can't focus," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You're distracted, careless, and clearly preoccupied with other matters." His lips curled into a sneer. "Tell me, how much longer do you plan on keeping up this charade? It's obvious that in your condition, you're a liability to this company." The words struck Elina like a blow. Her worst fear had come true. Her pregnancy was now a weapon, used against her to question her ability and her worth. She could feel her hands trembling as she held onto the files, her throat tightening as she struggled to keep her composure. Rhys's gaze was cold and unfeeling, his arms crossed as he continued his tirade. "Novatech needs employees who can focus, who bring efficiency to their work. And you, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, are anything but efficient. Elina could barely breathe. Every word cut deeper than the last, making her feel small, insignificant. She stole a glance around the room, hoping someone might intervene, might say something in her defense. But all she saw were averted eyes and uncomfortable expressions. No one dared speak up. They simply stood by, silent witnesses to her public shaming. Fighting back tears, Elina looked up, meeting Rhys's eyes. She wanted to defend herself, to tell him that she was doing her best under circumstances he couldn't possibly understand. But the words caught in her throat, suffocated by the weight of the moment. She couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. Rhys took a step back, his expression one of disgust. This company doesn't have time to babysit employees who can't leave their personal baggage at the door, he said coldly. If you're going to stay, I suggest you start acting like someone who actually deserves to be here. With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Elina standing there, shattered and exposed. The whisper started up as soon as he was gone, the quiet murmurs of her coworkers filling the silence. She could feel their eyes on her, each glance laced with pity or judgment, but no one approached her. They simply returned to their work, pretending as if nothing had happened. Elina took a shaky breath, gathering the strength to make her way back to her desk. She set down the stack of files and slowly sank into her chair, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She leaned forward, her head resting in her hands, and let the tears fall silently onto her desk. The pain of humiliation was sharp and consuming, and the weight of it pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. No one came to check on her, and no one asked if she was okay. The office continued to hum around her, an indifferent machine churning along without missing a beat. To them, her public humiliation was just another part of the daily grind. For the rest of the day, Elina worked mechanically, her mind numb from the sting of Rhys's words. She finished each task without thought, simply going through the motions, hoping to make it to the end of her shift without drawing any further attention. As the hours dragged on, Elina felt the hopelessness settling deeper into her chest. The job she had once thought would be her opportunity to build a stable life now felt like a prison, each day more oppressive than the last. Novatech, once a place of potential and ambition, had become a battleground where she was fighting a losing war. She had always known that her pregnancy might make her a target, but she had never imagined it would be used so brutally against her. When the workday finally ended, Elina quietly gathered her things, avoiding the gazes of her coworkers as she slipped out of the office. The moment she stepped outside, the cool evening air hit her face, offering a brief reprieve from the oppressive atmosphere inside. But even as she walked away from the building, the weight of the day clung to her, heavy and inescapable. Rhys's words echoed in her mind, replaying over and over until they were etched into her soul. She had been humiliated in front of everyone, reduced to little more than a liability in the eyes of her own CEO. The pain of it was raw and overwhelming, and for a moment, she felt as if she were drowning, struggling to stay afloat in a sea of doubt and despair. Elina's hand instinctively went to her stomach as she walked, feeling the faint movement of her baby inside her. It was a reminder of why she was fighting, why she couldn't give up, no matter how much she wanted to. This was her child, her future, and she was determined to protect it, even if it meant enduring days like this. But as she reached her apartment and sank onto her couch, the exhaustion took over, and the tears came freely. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling as the events of the day replayed in her mind. She didn't know how much longer she could endure this, how many more humiliations she could withstand before she broke completely. For now, all she could do was survive, to keep pushing forward for the sake of her child. But in her heart, a small seed of doubt had taken root, whispering that perhaps, no matter how hard she fought, her place at Novatech was slipping away, one painful encounter at a time. After the relentless stress and humiliation she had endured at work, Elina found herself yearning for the quiet sanctuary of her apartment. As soon as she unlocked the door, she dropped her bag on the small table by the entrance and let out a deep sigh, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. The peaceful silence was a stark contrast to the chaos and judgment she had faced at Novatech. As she kicked off her shoes and stepped toward the kitchen to fix a simple meal, something unusual caught her eye. A small white envelope sat on the floor just inside the front door. She frowned, not remembering seeing it when she first walked in. It was plain, with no markings or return address, only her name typed on the front in a crisp, formal font. A strange sense of unease crept over her as she reached down and picked it up. The envelope felt unnervingly heavy in her hand, as though it carried more than just words. Her heart began to race as she carefully opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper inside. The message was brief, but its impact was immediate. "We need to talk about the baby." Elina's breath caught in her throat as she read and reread the words, her mind racing with questions. Who could have sent this? Her hands began to tremble, and she carefully set the letter down on the kitchen counter, unable to fully process what it meant. Could it be him? The man she had met that fateful night? The possibility hung in the air, making her feel dizzy. She hadn't told anyone about her pregnancy, aside from her best friend Jessa, and even Jessa didn't know the full story. Elina had been so careful to keep her situation private, navigating each day with quiet resilience, hoping to protect herself and her child. But now, with this letter in hand, it was clear that someone else knew, someone who might have the answers she had never dared to seek. She couldn't help but wonder, was it him? Could the father of her child have somehow found her after all this time? And if so, why had he waited so long to reach out? Elina's mind swirled with emotions, a mix of fear, curiosity, and even a faint flicker of hope. She had spent countless hours thinking about him, wondering if he had ever thought of her, but she had long given up on any possibility of reconnecting. Her memories drifted back to that night. She had been working a high-profile charity event, managing details and assisting guests. She remembered feeling overwhelmed by the glamour and wealth surrounding her, so out of place among the city's elite. And then she had met him. A tall, confident man with warm eyes and a gentle smile that had melted her defenses. They had spent hours talking, sharing stories about their lives, dreams, and the quiet struggles they both carried. It had felt so natural, as if they had known each other for years. She remembered how safe she had felt, how for that one night she had let herself believe in the possibility of love, however fleeting it might be. She hadn't asked for his name, and he hadn't offered it. All she remembered were his initials and a small, unique detail, a custom watch with a sleek leather band and a design on the face she hadn't seen before. The memory brought a wave of emotions, leaving her conflicted. Part of her wanted to believe that he had found her, that he wanted to be involved, to help her through this difficult time. But another part of her, the part that had been hurt and abandoned in the past, warned her not to get her hopes up. Life had taught her to rely on herself, to protect her heart from disappointments that seemed inevitable. Elina sat down at the small kitchen table, staring at the letter as if it held all the answers she had ever needed. But its silence only deepened her questions. She tried to calm herself, thinking through the possibilities logically. If it wasn't him, then who else could know? And if it was him, what did he want? A sudden wave of worry washed over her. What if he wasn't reaching out with good intentions? She knew nothing about this man, beyond a few moments of kindness and warmth. She didn't know his history, his values, or if he was even the type of person she wanted in her child's life. The uncertainty was overwhelming, and it filled her with a growing sense of dread. She had fought so hard to build a life of stability, however fragile, and the thought of someone stepping in to disrupt it sent a chill down her spine. As the evening wore on, she found herself pacing her small apartment, her thoughts tangled in a web of fear, hope, and unanswered questions. She couldn't focus, her mind drifting back to the past, trying to piece together any details she might have missed, anything that could give her a clue about who this man truly was. A faint memory surfaced. His watch. It had seemed out of place on his wrist, sleek and unique, with a dark leather band and a design that looked almost custom-made. She remembered catching a glimpse of a small tattoo on his wrist, partially hidden beneath his sleeve, a symbol she hadn't recognized. It had been so brief, so easily overlooked. But now the memory felt significant, as if it were a clue she had ignored until now. Just then, her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Jessa, checking in as she often did. Elina stared at the screen, torn between the urge to confide in her friend and the desire to keep this secret to herself. She knew Jessa would support her and help her sort through the mess of emotions she was feeling. But Elina couldn't bring herself to share the letter just yet. This was something she needed to face on her own, at least for now. Taking a deep breath, Elina folded the letter and tucked it safely into her purse, feeling its weight even after it was out of sight. She didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain: her past was no longer buried. Whoever this man was, he knew about her baby, and he had somehow found her. For better or worse, her life was about to change, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. As the night wore on, Elina lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She knew she couldn't ignore the letter, couldn't pretend it didn't exist. But she also had no idea how to respond. Should she wait for another message? Should she try to find him herself, piece together the fragments of her memories and take a leap into the unknown? Resting her hand on her belly, she felt the gentle flutter of her baby moving inside her, a reminder of the life she was fighting to protect. Whatever happened next, she had to stay strong. She had to be ready for whatever this mysterious man, this letter, might bring into her life. As much as she tried to hold back the mixture of fear and hope, she couldn't shake the feeling that this letter was a turning point, a doorway into a future she had never imagined. Slowly, her eyes closed as exhaustion took over, pulling her into a restless sleep filled with fragmented memories and uncertain dreams. But one thought lingered as she drifted off. The past wasn't finished with her yet. The next morning at Novatech, Rhys Maddox sat in his office, staring out at the sprawling cityscape. To the world, he was a picture of success, cool, confident, and unshakable. But beneath the surface, Rhys was feeling the pressure more than ever. The company's numbers had been slipping, and he was acutely aware of the board's growing impatience. Investors had started asking questions, and rumors were beginning to circulate. Rhys knew that if he didn't secure a major deal soon, everything he had built could be at risk. Despite his outward appearance, Rhys hadn't been sleeping well. He found himself spending more and more time in his office, surrounded by stacks of reports and business projections that offered no comfort. His once steady confidence was starting to fray around the edges, and each passing day only seemed to deepen his unease. That afternoon, in a rare moment of procrastination, he decided to sift through some old files on his computer. He was scrolling aimlessly when he came across a folder marked Charity Gala, Spring. It was from a high-profile event he had attended months ago. He clicked it open, and a series of images filled his screen. Photos of elegantly dressed guests, clinking glasses and mingling under the soft glow of chandeliers. He barely remembered the event, just another social obligation he'd attended to maintain appearances. But as he scrolled through the images, a particular photo caught his eye. It was a candid shot of himself at the bar, drink in hand, his expression unusually relaxed. Next to him was a young woman with a warm smile, her face partially turned toward him, laughing at something he had said. Rhys froze, his heart skipping a beat. The woman in the photo looked familiar, too familiar. He zoomed in, his pulse quickening as he studied her face. The realization hit him with a force he hadn't anticipated. It was her. Elina, his receptionist. The very woman he had barely acknowledged at work, the same woman he had humiliated just days earlier, stood beside him in that photo, her laughter so genuine, so open. For a moment, Rhys couldn't breathe. Memories from that night, hazy and long forgotten, began flooding back with startling clarity. He remembered feeling an uncharacteristic sense of ease around her, as if he could let down his guard for the first time in years. They had talked about dreams and life, and he had been intrigued by her kindness and humility, qualities that were rare among the people he usually associated with. They had shared a moment, a spark that he'd dismissed as a passing distraction. He had left the next morning without a word, assuming it was just a fleeting encounter, nothing more. But now, as he stared at the photo, the implications became painfully clear. Elina was pregnant, and the baby was almost certainly his. A cold dread settled in the pit of his stomach as he remembered the rumors circulating in the office, rumors about Elina receiving an anonymous letter. He had dismissed the gossip at the time, finding it irrelevant to the company's needs. But now, the pieces were falling into place, and he couldn't ignore the truth. The baby she was carrying was his child, and he had unknowingly been treating her with nothing but disdain. His hands clenched into fists as he struggled to process the enormity of the situation. How had he not known? How could he have been so blind, so consumed by his own ambitions, that he failed to notice what was happening right in front of him? He had humiliated her and scorned her in front of their colleagues, all while she carried his child. The realization felt like a punch to the gut. Rhys rose from his chair, pacing the room as he tried to steady his thoughts. This wasn't just a business problem that could be solved with a calculated decision. This was deeply personal, and it demanded a response he wasn't sure he was prepared to give. He stopped in front of the window, staring out at the city without really seeing it. He had prided himself on being untouchable, the kind of man who could outmaneuver anyone, who never allowed his emotions to interfere with his judgment. But now, standing there with the knowledge that he was going to be a father, he felt vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt in years. The control he had so meticulously cultivated was slipping, and he didn't know how to get it back. Rhys's phone buzzed on his desk, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his assistant, reminding him of a meeting with potential investors in an hour. He glanced at the clock, knowing he should focus on the fact that the company's future depended on his ability to secure new funding. But his mind was elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of Elina and the baby she carried. His child. For the first time in his life, Rhys felt truly conflicted, caught between his responsibilities to the company he had built and the unexpected reality of impending fatherhood. He knew he couldn't ignore it, couldn't simply brush it aside as an inconvenience. This was his responsibility, one he couldn't escape, no matter how much simpler it would be to turn his back. With a deep breath, Rhys closed the file and stood up, a determination settling over him. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't pretend that everything was normal, and couldn't go on treating Elina as if she were just another employee. He needed to confront her and find a way to make amends if that was even possible. He had wronged her, and now, knowing what he knew, he felt an overwhelming need to set things right. He left his office, his mind racing as he made his way through the bustling hallways toward the reception desk where Elina worked. He spotted her talking quietly with a colleague, her expression weary yet resilient, her hands instinctively resting over her belly as if in silent protection. Rhys felt a pang of guilt, his heart heavy with regret for the pain he had caused her. Summoning his courage, he approached, his voice low but firm as he called her name. "Elina, we need to talk." Elina's eyes widened as she looked up, a flicker of confusion and fear crossing her face. She hadn't expected him to address her directly, let alone in such a serious tone. The tension between them was thick, charged with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Rhys gestured toward a nearby meeting room, and after a moment's hesitation, Elina nodded, following him. Once inside, he closed the door, taking a deep breath before turning to face her. For the first time in his life, Rhys felt at a loss for words, the weight of his actions pressing down on him as he struggled to find the right way to begin. Finally, he cut straight to the heart of the matter, his voice low and steady. "The baby," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "It's mine, isn't it?" Elina's breath hitched, her eyes widening in surprise. She hadn't expected him to confront her like this, to ask so bluntly. She felt her heart racing as she tried to process his words, to make sense of the intensity in his gaze. How had he figured it out? And why did he seem so conflicted? Rhys took her silence as confirmation, and his jaw tightened. "All this time, you knew who I was, didn't you?" he asked, his voice tinged with accusation. "You knew from the beginning." Elina shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No, Rhys, I didn't know," she replied, her tone laced with a mix of exhaustion and frustration. "I only found out who you were after I was already pregnant." Rhys's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He had been so sure, so convinced that she had known all along. But as he looked into her eyes, he realized he might have been wrong. that he had misjudged her in ways he hadn't expected. There was a long, tense silence between them, each grappling with the weight of the situation. Rhys felt his anger give way to something else, a feeling he couldn't quite name. He hadn't anticipated her strength, her quiet resilience, and for the first time he began to question everything he thought he knew about her. He knew he had to make a choice, to accept the responsibility he had unwittingly avoided or risk losing everything that truly mattered. For Rhys, the path forward had never felt more uncertain. Rhys returned to his office, his mind spinning with everything that had just unfolded. The realization that Elina's baby was his had left him feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced before. He was a man who thrived on control, who orchestrated every detail of his life with precision. But now, faced with the prospect of fatherhood, his usual confidence had been replaced by a gnawing sense of doubt. He sank into his leather chair, rubbing his temples as he tried to make sense of his thoughts. His life had always been about the relentless pursuit of success, of building Novatech into a powerhouse in the tech industry. Emotions were a liability, and attachments a distraction. That was the belief he had held for as long as he could remember. But now, with the knowledge that he was going to be a father, that rigid worldview was beginning to unravel. Rhys's father had been much the same, a distant, demanding figure whose life revolved around his own career. Growing up, Rhys had watched as his father poured everything into his business, often leaving him and his mother as afterthoughts. It had been painful, but Rhys had internalized the lesson. Success required sacrifice. Over the years he had built up his own empire, swearing to himself that he would never let anyone stand in the way of his ambition. But now, for the first time, he questioned that choice. He leaned back, staring up at the ceiling, as memories from his childhood washed over him. He remembered the long, empty dinners and the silent family vacations, where his father would spend hours on the phone, too busy to engage with his own family. Rhys had vowed he would be different, that he wouldn't repeat those mistakes. But here he was, on the precipice of fatherhood, and he was terrified of becoming the very thing he had despised in his father. A man so focused on his career that he forgot what truly mattered. The baby, his child. The words felt foreign yet powerful, grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. Could he really be a father? Did he have it in him to step up and offer Elina and the child the support and stability they needed? The question gnawed at him, casting doubt over the carefully constructed life he had built. The days following his confrontation with Elina were a blur. He found himself spending long hours in his office, distracted and irritable, his mind never far from the question of what he would do. The board members were growing impatient, demanding answers about the company's performance, pressuring him to secure the deal that could save Novatech from its recent financial decline. Normally, Rhys would have handled them with ease, reasserting his authority and reminding them why he was the one in charge. But now, for the first time, he felt something slipping: his focus, his drive, even his purpose. Rhys tried to push aside his personal concerns, forcing himself to focus on the needs of the company. But every time he sat down to tackle a business proposal or investor report, his thoughts drifted back to Elina. He had seen a new side of her in that brief, tense conversation. She was strong and resilient, and she hadn't crumbled under his accusations or assumptions. Instead, she had met his gaze with a quiet dignity that made him question everything he thought he knew about her. He found himself watching her from a distance, observing the way she carried herself, the quiet determination in her eyes. Despite the challenges she faced, she never faltered and never asked for sympathy or help. She was a far cry from the liability he had once accused her of being. In fact, she was one of the strongest people he had ever known. And that realization only deepened his internal struggle. One evening, as most of the staff had gone home, Rhys wandered the empty halls of Novatech, his mind heavy with conflicting thoughts. The quietness of the office building was unsettling, amplifying his unease. He passed by the reception area, where Elina was finishing up some paperwork, the glow from her computer screen casting soft shadows across her face. She looked tired, but there was a calm focus about her that made him pause. For a moment he just watched her, taking in the strength she radiated even in her quietest moments. He knew she was carrying a heavy burden, but she bore it with a grace that left him feeling strangely humbled. He had spent years dismissing emotions as weaknesses, ignoring anything that didn't serve his ambition. But Elina's resilience, her quiet strength, was making him question everything he had built his life around. Rhys walked away, his thoughts even more muddled. He returned to his office, sitting down at his desk as he stared blankly at the lights of the city outside his window. The world continued to move around him, but he felt frozen, stuck at a crossroads he had never anticipated. The board's demands grew louder in his mind, echoing through his thoughts like an endless drumbeat. Richard, one of the more outspoken members, had been particularly vocal, his patience wearing thin. Rhys knew he couldn't ignore their concerns forever. The company was struggling, and without a decisive move, Novatech could crumble. His entire career and identity were tied to this company. But he couldn't deny the change stirring within him, the new weight he felt, a responsibility he had never expected to bear. One evening, as Rhys sat alone in his office, the phone on his desk rang, jarring him from his thoughts. It was Richard, his voice curt and demanding. "Rhys, the board needs answers. You've been avoiding our calls for days. We need to know where you stand. Are you prepared to make the decision that will keep this company afloat?" Rhys felt a surge of irritation and heavy exhaustion. Normally, he would have been quick to reassure Richard, assert his control, and make it clear that he had everything under control. But now, the weight of it all felt crushing, and he wasn't sure he could carry it alone anymore. After the call ended, Rhys sat in silence, staring at the city lights. He had a choice to make, and the decision felt impossible. He could continue down the path he had always known, the path of ruthless ambition and calculated detachment. Or he could open himself up to something new, something that terrified him in ways that business never had. The realization settled over him slowly, like the dawn breaking through a long night. He couldn't keep living the way he had, couldn't keep ignoring the parts of himself he had buried in the name of success. He wanted something more than just power and prestige. He wanted to be a father, to be there for Elina and their child, to build something real and lasting beyond the walls of Novatech. It wasn't a simple choice, and it wouldn't be easy. But Rhys knew that if he didn't take this step, he would regret it for the rest of his life. The life he had built, the person he had become, it wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to be more, to become someone worthy of the trust and hope that Elina had unknowingly placed in him. The quiet resolve settled in his heart as he stood up, his decision made. He would speak to the board, face whatever consequences might come, and make arrangements to step back from the company, at least temporarily. Novatech could survive without him for a while, but Elina and his child needed him now. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to prioritize something other than himself. Rhys took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he was ready to face it, to fight for something more meaningful than business or ambition. He was ready to be the man Elina and their child deserved. Tomorrow, he would begin the first steps toward that future, no matter how uncertain it seemed. He had finally found something worth fighting for, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The next morning, Rhys stood in the glass-walled boardroom at Novatech, looking out over the city as he prepared for the most important meeting of his life. Around the large conference table sat the company's board members, their expressions a mixture of expectation and impatience. Richard, one of the sternest board members, was reviewing his notes, his gaze fixed on Rhys with barely concealed frustration. This meeting was intended to finalize the deal that could potentially save Novatech's future, a high-stakes merger that had been in the works for weeks. Everyone was counting on Rhys to deliver, pull the company out of its financial slump, and secure its place as a leading force in the industry. But Rhys's mind wasn't on profit margins or shareholder value. His thoughts were with Elina and the child she carried, the family he had only just discovered he wanted. Richard glanced up from his papers, giving Rhys an impatient look. "Mr. Maddox, we're all here to finalize your decision on the merger. Are we moving forward or not?" Rhys took a deep breath, steeling himself. This was the moment he had been dreading, the choice he had been avoiding. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. The company, his reputation, his future, all of it depended on his answer. But his heart was leading him down a path he had never considered before, and for once he was willing to follow it. Before he could respond, the door to the boardroom opened. Every head turned as Elina stepped into the room. Her face was calm but determined, and she held her head high despite the curious and confused looks she received from the board members. Rhys's heart skipped a beat as he watched her approach, feeling both pride and apprehension. "Elina," he said, his voice low and tense. He hadn't expected to see her here, especially not in front of the board. But she seemed resolute, her eyes meeting his with a steady gaze that made it clear she had something important to say. Ignoring the murmurs around the table, Elina took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering as she addressed the room. "I'm here because there's something that needs to be said," she began, her voice strong and clear. "Mr. Maddox and I have a personal matter to address, one that I believe everyone here deserves to know about." The board members exchanged glances, a mix of shock and confusion evident on their faces. Richard cleared his throat, his expression hardening. "And what exactly is this about, Miss Hughes?" Elina took a step forward, her hand instinctively resting over her belly. "I'm pregnant," she announced, her voice unwavering. "And Rhys Maddox is the father." A heavy silence fell over the room. The board members stared at Rhys, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and judgment. Rhys met their gazes, feeling the weight of the revelation settle around him. He had always been known as a man of control, a CEO who let nothing interfere with his professional image. But now, that carefully crafted image was beginning to crumble, exposed by the truth he could no longer hide. Richard's face darkened, his voice filled with barely restrained anger as he spoke. "Is this true, Mr. Maddox?" he demanded, his tone sharp and unforgiving. Rhys took a deep breath, nodding. "Yes, it's true," he said, his voice steady but solemn. "Elina is carrying my child." The boardroom erupted in a flurry of whispers, the shock and outrage palpable. This was more than just a personal scandal. It was a potential disaster for Novatech's reputation, especially with the merger hanging in the balance. Rhys could feel the judgment in the room, the unspoken accusations, and the disbelief etched into every face. But despite the chaos, he stood firm, determined to face the consequences of his actions. Richard was the first to regain his composure, his voice cold and accusatory. "And what does this mean for Novatech?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "Are you prepared to abandon this company and walk away from everything you've built?" Rhys's gaze didn't waver as he met Richard's stare. "I built Novatech from the ground up," he replied, his tone calm but resolute. "But right now I have a responsibility that goes beyond the company. I need to be there for Elina and our child, and that means taking time away to focus on my family." A stunned silence fell over the boardroom as the gravity of his words settled over everyone. Rhys could feel the weight of their judgment, the disbelief that he, a man who had dedicated his life to this company, was choosing to step back for the sake of a family. But he had made his decision, and he knew in his heart that it was the right one. Richard's face was a mask of fury as he leaned forward, his voice laced with contempt. "You can't just walk away, Rhys. The company needs you. If you step down now, you're risking everything we've worked for." Rhys felt a flicker of doubt, but he pushed it aside, standing his ground. "I've laid the groundwork for the merger," he replied, his voice calm. "The company can survive without me for a while, but if I don't take this time, I may lose something far more important than Novatech." For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room was thick, the board members exchanging uncertain glances. But then, to Rhys's surprise, one of the senior board members, a woman named Margaret, known for her fairness, spoke up. "Perhaps Rhys is right," she said quietly, her gaze thoughtful. "We've focused so much on success that we've forgotten about the people behind it. If Rhys needs time, maybe we should give it to him." There were murmurs of agreement around the table, much to Richard's dismay. Rhys felt a surge of gratitude for Margaret's support, a sense of relief washing over him. He had expected a fight, a battle to defend his choice, but instead he found understanding. For the first time, he felt as though he could step away without sacrificing everything he had worked for. As the meeting drew to a close, Rhys walked over to Elina, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He had faced the board, made his decision, and now he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. "I don't know if I can make up for everything," he said quietly, his gaze meeting hers. "But I'm willing to try if you'll let me." Elina looked at him for a long moment, the weight of their past mistakes hanging between them. She had seen a different side of him today, a man who was willing to sacrifice everything for his family, even if it meant stepping away from the company he had built. It wasn't an easy decision, and she knew it would take time for them to rebuild the trust they had lost. Finally she nodded, her voice soft but firm. "We'll see," she replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. "But it's going to take time, Rhys." Rhys felt a warmth spread through him, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "I'm ready for that," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. As they left the boardroom together, side by side, Rhys felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had lost control of the company, at least for a while, but he had found something far more important. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it with Elina by his side, ready to build a future that wasn't just about power or success. It was about family. For the first time, Rhys felt he was on the right path, one that he would walk with purpose and love. And as he looked over at Elina, he knew that no matter the challenges, they would face the future together. In the weeks following Rhys's decision to temporarily step down from his role at Novatech, life took on a new rhythm for both him and Elina. The decision had sent shockwaves through the company, and Rhys knew his reputation as the uncompromising CEO had forever changed. He wasn't sure what would happen when he eventually returned to Novatech, but for the first time, he didn't let the uncertainty consume him. Instead, he focused on what mattered most: the life he was building with Elina and the child they were expecting. Adjusting to this new role was far from easy. Rhys found himself in uncharted territory, unsure of how to express his feelings or how to support Elina through her pregnancy. He had spent years mastering the art of negotiation and decision-making, but he had little experience with compassion or tenderness. Yet he was determined to learn, willing to adapt in ways he had never considered before. Elina, too, was adjusting to the presence of Rhys in her life. She had been fiercely independent, learning to rely on herself and carefully guarding her heart. She had never imagined that Rhys would step forward to take responsibility, let alone commit to being a father. And though she had agreed to give him a chance, she was cautious, unsure if he could truly be the man she and her child needed him to be. Their first few weeks together were tentative, filled with moments of awkwardness and vulnerability. Rhys, used to giving orders, had to learn to listen, to be patient, and to respect Elina's boundaries. He tried to be there for her, accompanying her to doctor's appointments, learning about her daily routine, and asking questions about the baby's health and development. He was clumsy at times, occasionally overstepping, but Elina couldn't deny the effort he was making. One afternoon, as they sat together in a waiting room before one of her appointments, Rhys noticed Elina's nervous fidgeting. She rarely let her guard down, even around him, but he could sense the anxiety radiating off her. Gently, he reached over, his hand brushing hers. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Elina looked down at their hands, her heart skipping a beat at the simple gesture of closeness. She took a deep breath, finally letting herself acknowledge the emotions she had been holding back. "It's just... everything is so different now," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I never imagined it would be like this. I thought I'd be doing all of this alone." Rhys squeezed her hand gently. "I know I don't have the best track record," he said, a hint of self-awareness in his voice. "But I'm here now. I want to help, Elina. I want to be there for both of you, no matter what it takes." She looked up, meeting his gaze, searching for sincerity in his eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that he meant it, that he was genuinely committed to being part of her life and their children. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. She gave him a small nod, her lips curving into a tentative smile. In the days that followed, Elina noticed subtle changes in Rhys. He became more considerate and more attuned to her needs, learning to anticipate the small things that made a difference. He would bring her tea in the mornings, knowing she was often nauseated, and he adjusted his schedule to ensure he could attend every appointment with her. These gestures didn't erase the hurt or the misunderstandings of the past, but they planted seeds of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, he could become the partner and father she had once thought impossible. One evening, as they were preparing a simple dinner in her small kitchen, Rhys seemed to hesitate before speaking. "Elina," he began, his tone unusually hesitant, "I've been thinking about our child's future. I know we're still working through things, but I want to be clear. I'm here for the long haul." Elina looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his eyes. Rhys was a man who never showed weakness and projected an image of absolute control. But here he was, standing in her modest kitchen, openly admitting his intentions, his desire to be part of their family. "I don't want you to feel like I'm trying to take over," he continued, his voice steady. "This is your life, your choice, and I respect that. But I want to be there for you, for our child. I want to be someone you can rely on." Elina's heart softened as she took in his words. She had spent so long guarding herself, preparing to raise her child alone, that allowing someone else in felt both terrifying and liberating. She nodded slowly, her gaze holding his as she replied, "I know, Rhys. I can see you're trying, and I appreciate it. It means more than you know." Over time, their relationship began to blossom. It wasn't perfect, and there were days when old insecurities surfaced, such as when Rhys's demanding nature clashed with Elina's independence. However, with each disagreement, they learned more about each other, finding a rhythm and understanding that brought them closer together. As Elina's pregnancy progressed, they began to talk about the future, about co-parenting, and about the kind of family they wanted to create. Rhys often spoke about his own upbringing, sharing glimpses of the strained relationship he had with his father and the distance that had always divided them. He admitted that he was scared, that he didn't want to make the same mistakes, to repeat the cycle of detachment and neglect that had defined his childhood. Elina listened, her empathy growing as she learned more about the man behind the CEO facade. She hadn't known this side of Rhys, the man who harbored fears and regrets, who wanted something better for his child than what he had experienced. In those quiet moments, she felt the walls between them begin to dissolve, replaced by a shared determination to build a life grounded in trust and care. One evening, as they sat together on her small balcony, Rhys reached over, gently placing his hand on her belly. The baby moved, a faint but unmistakable flutter, and Rhys's eyes lit up with wonder. Elina couldn't help but smile, moved by the awe in his expression. It was a simple moment, but it felt profound, a reminder of the new beginning they were creating together. "I can't believe that's our child," Rhys murmured, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "I never thought I'd feel this way." Elina placed her hand over his, her heart swelling with hope. "Neither did I," she replied, her voice soft. "But maybe we can do this, Rhys. Maybe we can make this work." Rhys looked at her, a rare vulnerability in his eyes. "I want that, Elina," he said, his tone earnest. "I want to be someone you can trust, someone our child can look up to." In that moment, they both understood that their journey was only beginning and that there would be challenges ahead, but they were ready to face them, to build a future that was stronger and more fulfilling than anything they had known before. As the months went by, their bond deepened. They found joy in the small moments, preparing for the baby's arrival, laughing together over late-night cravings, and sharing quiet conversations about their hopes and dreams for their child. Rhys continued to grow and soften, becoming the partner Elina had never dared to hope for. And Elina, in turn, began to open her heart, allowing herself to believe in the possibility of family. When the day finally arrived and they welcomed their child into the world, they stood side by side, united by the love and commitment they had built. Rhys held their newborn daughter in his arms, his gaze filled with wonder and gratitude. In that moment, he knew he had found something greater than success, something worth every sacrifice. Together, they had found a new beginning, one that promised a future filled with love, resilience, and hope that would carry them through whatever lay ahead. The journey of Elina and Rhys in this story holds a powerful message about growth, resilience, and the transformative power of love and responsibility. Through their story, we see how two people from very different worlds come together to build a family based on trust, respect, and shared values. Rhys, who had always been single-mindedly focused on his career, learns the value of balance and compassion as he steps up to become the father he never thought he could be. Meanwhile, Elina's strength, independence, and determination guide her as she navigates the challenges of single motherhood and learns to let someone else into her life. One of the biggest lessons from their journey is the importance of vulnerability and forgiveness. Both Elina and Rhys had to confront their fears and insecurities, learning to let go of past hurts and open their hearts to new possibilities. Their story reminds us that true success isn't just about personal achievements, but about the relationships we build, the compassion we show, and the commitment we make to those we love. This story also highlights how love can bring out the best in us, helping us grow beyond what we thought possible. Rhys's journey from a powerful but isolated CEO to a caring father and partner is a testament to how love and responsibility can soften even the hardest of hearts. It's a reminder that sometimes stepping away from ambition and embracing humility can lead to the most fulfilling path of all. As we reflect on their story, we're reminded that change and growth are always possible, no matter our past choices. Their journey encourages us to take risks for the people who matter, to forgive, and to always remain open to the unexpected possibilities life offers. If you found this story touching, comment with 1. If you found it very inspiring, comment with 2. And feel free to share your own stories with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more heartwarming and inspiring stories like this one. Share your thoughts about this story in the comments below.